All right, hi everyone. Let's get this event started. I'm Gabriel Metcalf, CEO of the Committee for Sydney. Thank you for joining today's edition of Committee for Sydney Live, the think tanks. What are the essential post-COVID reforms Australia should undertake? To start, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. While we are meeting online and you may be in a different part of the world, I am currently on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people who occupied this part of the Sydney coast. Today, we are having a discussion with three distinguished policy thinkers, leaders from think tanks in Australia, on the question of where next for Australia post-COVID. For the structure, it's going to be very simple. There is one question that we're posing to each of them. What are the three biggest things government should do to reform Australia post-COVID? So it's a focused question that I think is going to actually open up a lot of interesting territory to talk about. So let me tell you who the speakers are. Danielle Wood is the CEO of the Grattan Institute. She has published extensively on economic reform priorities, budget policy, tax reform, generational inequality, and reforming political institutions. Danielle is also National President of the Economic Society of Australia and co-founder and former chair of the Women in Economics Network. Nick Cater is the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, the Liberal Party's think tank. He was the Deputy Editor of the Sunday Telegraph in Sydney and editor of the Weekend Australian and Hong Kong correspondent for News Corp. His affection for his adopted country was explained in his acclaimed best-selling book, The Lucky Culture. Emma Dawson is the Executive Director of Capita. Formerly, she was the Senior Advisor on Digital Inclusion at Telstra, Executive Director of the Institute for a Broadband-Enabled Society at the University of Melbourne, and a Senior Policy Advisor in the Rudd and Gillard Labor governments. She sits on the board of the Prader-Willi Research Foundation and is an honorary fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. All right, so these are three really knowledgeable people from three organizations I know we pay a lot of attention to at the committee. So it is a real honor to bring them together for this event. So we're gonna ask each one to present and then open it up to Q&A and discussion, which you can submit via the Q&A app on Zoom. Danielle, let's start with you.
Thanks very much, Gabrielle. And I was saying before we started the broadcast that choosing only three reforms is sort of like choosing between your children, especially when you work at a place like Grattan, where we've published more than 130 reports about policy reform. And looking back at the list of the ones that haven't yet made it into policy, I think most of them at least still make sense, or in some cases I think there is a greater imperative to implement them in a post-COVID world. So the three I'm going to choose, the first one I would kick off with, I'd say, is probably less a reform, but I do think it is the most important policy decision governments face for the here and now. And that's really how we are going to handle the recovery from the crisis over the next 18 months. The RBA's current forecasts have unemployment at 10% at the end of this year, still at 9% by mid next year. And quite frankly, that's too high for too long. We know so much now about the scarring effects of extended spells of unemployment, particularly for young people. We will see the impacts on their work patterns, on their wages, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the track. There's also a really important macroeconomics literature that's emerging about the longer term impact on growth of running your economy below potential for an extended period. So my number one recommendation would be that state and federal governments commit to a substantial additional fiscal stimulus, probably in the order of $100 billion, if we want to bring unemployment down closer to the natural rate over the next 18 months. So the focus of that stimulus should be job creation, it should be boosting consumption and investment, as well as addressing areas of social need. And I'm certainly happy to talk more about what that might look like. The second one I've chosen is something that's also, I think, really important for the economic recovery. It's also important for boosting the long run capacity of the economy. And it's also important social policy, and that is reducing out-of-pocket costs for early childhood education and care. So Australians pay some of the highest costs for childcare in the developed world. It means that many children, including those who benefit most, are missing out on the benefits of an early childhood education. We know so much now about how important high quality early learning is for brain development and long-term outcomes. So I think it's imperative that we give all children the opportunity. I also say it's an economic reform because the current fees are a big deterrent to work for single parents and for second earners in couple households who are largely women. And that's particularly true for working beyond 3 days a week. So we've just released a report with significant modelling showing, right across the income distribution, after tax, after the clawback of welfare benefits, out-of-pocket childcare costs mean that mothers are losing 80, 90, even 100% of their take-home pay for an additional day's work. Given, I think most of us don't like the idea of working for nothing or virtually nothing, we end up in a situation where we have a highly educated workforce working part-time. That is the norm. That's the sort of standard model in Australia, and it looks quite different elsewhere in the world. So reducing those financial disincentives would substantially boost workforce participation. We estimate if you put $5 billion into additional subsidies, you'd boost GDP by about $11 billion a year. That is on par with the more optimistic estimates of the boost to national income from a company tax cut, to give you some idea of the scale. The third reform is, I'm going to choose an institutional one because I think getting the institutional settings right is so important for policy making in general. So I would love to see a package of integrity reforms covering off political donations, lobbying, and some form of integrity commission at the Commonwealth level. Certainly most states are already far ahead of the Commonwealth in terms of the checks and balances. Our work has shown that the system as it stands tilts the playing field too far towards the well-resourced and the highly motivated. So there's no cap on the amount of money that can go into the Commonwealth political system, nor is the source of money transparent. We have no visibility over who our Commonwealth ministers meet with. Many of them go on to take lobbying roles straight after politics. So I think strengthening those checks and balances is a really important long-term reform. I think it would boost the contestability of our policy environment. And I think broadening the range of voices in policy debates is something that is going to give us the best chance of seeing policy made in the public interest and not for vested interests. Thanks. You're on mute, Gabrielle.
You'd think I'd be good at this by now. Thank you, Danielle. Nick, let's go to you next. Nick, you're on mute.
Right, you just missed a bit where I was thanking you profusely for staging this event and Danielle for her contribution. So I think I'm at the moment. The Menzies Research Centre is probably disappointing the old guard reformers of the 1990s and early 2000s. Who see reform as a big thing. They want us to come in and rewrite the Tax Act. They want us to change the industrial relations system and all this. That kind of reform is not feasible in this world. Neither is it helpful. So when we're looking at reform, I think we're looking more at really applying an innovative approach to this. So an innovation is about tinkering and gradual improvement. That's where we believe we should be looking, but directed I will direct this at 3 specific goals. The first, and I think what's emerging as probably the most important reform that we need out of this, is for governments to do what they do more effectively and efficiently. Government service delivery should be top of the agenda as we emerge from this crisis, because we've had vivid illustrations of how failures in government service delivery have tremendous consequences. We believe that taxpayers have a right to know that the government will deliver on its promise to do whatever it is assigned to do well. To give you one example of how this is playing out right now, the New South Wales government has, for the last 6 years or probably a little bit longer, been heavily investing in service delivery. They've set up a customer service department. They've invested heavily in digital technology and breaking down silos. And the result of that was that with COVID-19, they were very quickly able to repurpose a lot of this infrastructure that they'd established to deal with COVID-19. So track and trace, for instance, issuing permits to cross borders, was able to do it quite effectively and efficiently. And what's more, I think that it also meant that they were able to control the spread of the virus much more effectively. And much of what's going on in Victoria, I think, is an indication that they haven't invested in that infrastructure and the several billions of dollars it's taken to get New South Wales to this level. They haven't looked at that so determinedly, and I think that you're seeing the results now. And as a sidetrack to that, I'd just say that I think, like most people on the centre right, used to be probably rather too focused on fiscal matters, i.e. we do comparisons between the states about how much it costs to put, say, for instance, somebody behind bars in Sydney compared to Brisbane. It's a vital metric, obviously, but it's quite clear now that actually it's only a forerunner to the most important metric, and that is, are you delivering the services that are required? And if we discovered as part of this that it costs, say, twice as much to keep somebody in an aged care home in New South Wales than it does in Victoria, I don't think it does, incidentally, but if we were to discover that, we'd say that's probably money well spent. So government should do what it does effectively, efficiently, and then it should create every opportunity and remove every obstacle for individuals to strive and thrive. The barriers to people establishing small businesses, for instance. Already before this COVID-19 crisis, a lot of people were concerned about the lack of, or the declining entrepreneurial spirit, the declining willingness of people to take risks, and this is particularly stark in the under 35s group. So we have to, having going through what looks like a small business recession, we have to reinvigorate the small business entrepreneurial sector, and that will lead to a lot of policy solutions from us. There's no big bang way of doing it, but you can, for instance, look at taxation arrangements. You can look at bankruptcy laws, as is already occurring. You can look, of course, at green tape, red tape, you name it. And at the higher end of town, we should be looking at the other obstacles or the other drag on their productivity. And I'm thinking particularly the work we're doing at the moment on litigation funding and trying to eliminate and simplifying corporate regulations. So the third area where we should be directing attention is in our productivity. We're looking to repatriate or to get business manufacturing established in Australia. The only sound way to do that, the only long-term sustainable way, in our view, will be to fix all the things that drove manufacturing offshore in the first place. And that's hard work, and there's a lot of it, but we work through that one by one. That might lead us, for instance, to simplifying the award system. It would certainly lead us to simplifying development approval process and a whole lot of other things. There are lots of green shoots, I think, lots of exciting things coming out of this, but if there's one, it's what we're doing now. I think the whole country, right from the very old to the very young, have undergone a rapid training course in digital technology in the last 6 months. And if we can harness this now to do things better and smarter using the technology available to us, I believe we'll see a productivity boost in that alone. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. All right, Emma, over to you.
Thanks, Gabrielle, and thank you, Danielle and Nick, for your thoughts. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation here in lockdown Melbourne at the moment, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So like Danielle, coming up with just 3 things was quite a challenge. And I have, similarly to the way she has, tried to frame it around what I think is the core task to restore our economy and rebuild our society after this significant shock. And the framework for that, again, a bit similarly to what Danielle started out by saying, for me, is to, as rapidly as possible, achieve full employment in the economy and ensure that we are running the economy as close as possible to its productive capacity. And that means creating jobs. I do believe there's a role for government in job creation. That does not mean that I believe in a kind of job guarantee, digging holes and filling them in again model. So the three areas that I think government should pay attention to in the medium term as we recover from this crisis, the reform issues, if you like, rather than just the immediate need for fiscal stimulus, which is the obvious imperative now. The first is to invest in skills and education for Australians. And rather than continue to fill our skills gaps with temporary visa holders and relying on high levels of immigration, although I am a pro-immigration thinker and think that immigration is overwhelmingly good for the country, I think a concerted investment in skills and education throughout the life course for Australians will be absolutely critical to ensuring that we have a workforce that is able to meet the challenges of changing technology, adapt to changing workforce practices, and to those new industries, such as Nick referred to, hopefully new manufacturing, advanced manufacturing industries in the country. And there are two areas in particular that I think need urgent government attention. The first is investment in early childhood education and care. We know, as Danielle said, that investing in 2 years of universal early learning for children aged 3 and 4 is the best possible intervention we can make to stimulate their neural pathways and give those kids an equal chance and an equal start in life. And the other area is to invest in vocational training and education, so to restore funding to TAFE and to link those TAFE courses, make them as affordable or even freely available as we have done in Victoria, where there are skill shortages in the economy. And that's critical, that it's not just about school leavers, but those courses are accessible to people throughout their lives, and the people are supported to train and reskill as they need to. The second area for reform I would like to see is to move away from this fear of industry policy as being about picking winners. And I was pleased to see even the Business Council come out recently and say they wanted the government to pick winners. I don't think it is about picking winners. I think what we need is a smart government approach to creating certainty for business to invest. Even prior to this crisis, we were seeing very low levels of business investment for the last decade since the GFC. Although there have been reasonable productivity gains in that time, the money has not been returned to investing in future productivity gains and future growth. And so I think the role of government there is not to pick winners, but to create certainty for business. And so to have smart, targeted industry policies, obviously around things like the renewables sector, but to allow the market to decide where it's going to invest its money and create jobs with certainty around the tax settings, the regulatory settings that are going to be implemented, and really also to target specific regions. So to identify those regions of Australia that have previously relied on certain primary industries that may be under threat due to technological change or automation or the need to decarbonise, and identify what the next big industry sectors are going to be in those specific areas of regional Australia. And the third is, and this is a pet project of mine, is that I'd like to see a significant investment in the foundational economy. Hello. By which I mean the economy and the jobs in which the majority of Australians work. So those jobs that are often regarded as mundane, inconsequential, even not worthy of recognition, particularly care work and the work that's often done by women. Some really interesting research from the Women's Budget Group in the UK a couple of years ago found that an investment in the care economy compared to an equivalent investment in construction would have a greater economic return for the country on a number of fronts. It closes the gender employment gap and the gender pay gap. It creates net more jobs jobs than does a similar investment in construction. And it has a higher multiplier effect because of the benefits of improving the care that we give to our children and to our elderly relatives and to people with disabilities and long-term health conditions. That creates the kind of confidence in those systems that mean, as Danielle said, more women can get back into the workforce. And it really does, those jobs are not easily automated and not easily disrupted by technological change, but they are underpaid and undervalued. And if we want to avoid the kinds of things we're seeing in aged care now, and certainly some of the challenges arising through the disability insurance scheme, then we need to rethink how we value that work on which so many of us rely, which has become really obvious during this crisis. They're my top three.
All right. Thank you. This is exactly as we hoped. This is laying out so many different ideas. So everybody, feel free to submit questions via the Q&A app. Let me start out. Nick, I want to pick up on just a side comment you made about major reform of the type people would associate with Hawke and Keating and maybe Howard is not feasible anymore. That happens to be the subject of a paper that Grattan just put out about the good old days of reform, where John Daly asked, are we being nostalgic, or is it really true that Australia used to be capable of bigger reforms? And he answered, no, it is true. Australia used to be capable of more major reforms. So it sounds like your intuition, Nick, matches that. So Nick, what do you mean it's not feasible, and what would it take to make it be feasible?
Well, one thing is we did need to make a massive transition in the 80s, and it's very similar to what happened around much of the rest of the world, sometimes interestingly by conservative governments, sometimes by governments on the left, Labor government here and in New Zealand, for instance. And they were one-off big things that had to be done. So, floating the currency, et cetera, deregulating banks, the whole suite of things that happened. But I'm not convinced that kind of reform is going to get us very far right now, even if we could do it. And the thing you mentioned at the beginning, that we are affiliated with the Liberal Party, the thing that does for us is make us very focused on a policy that we believe a government can deliver, that a government, and we'd love to see, a look at the taxation base, changing the taxation mix. We'd all love that. But I'm sure all the three of us would agree that there are changes that need to be made there. We'd love to see some simplifying of the, the award system and all those kind of things, and that may happen, but if it will happen incrementally. So, and this I think is a much more natural way for a country and an economy to develop anyway. We evolve, we evolve into a better society. We don't suddenly create one. At least that's our perspective. And so there's a lot we can do by focusing on the end game. Say, for instance, our end game is to get more people in small business creating risk, growing the economy that way. Then there are probably reforms in 6 different portfolio areas you probably have to make, you could usefully make at any rate, to make that more likely. So it's, the enemy is the perfect is the enemy of the good, of course. And so we're out to achieve what we can achieve incrementally to make this a better country and to make improve people's lives.
Okay, so it's sort of, from you, Nick, a principled defense of incrementalism.
Yeah.
Danielle, how do you think about this? Is it really true that the good old days were better? Yeah, you have some ideas that are not incremental.
Yeah, that's true. And look, I think the John Daly piece that you referred to is part of a broader look he's doing, essentially looking back over his 11 years as CEO of Grattan and sort of tracking through everything we've recommended and looking at the major blockers to reform. But that particular piece was just looking back over the recommendations for policy reforms that the OECD has made for Australia over the past 11 years and the government take up of those ideas. And of course, no one's saying that the OECD has all the answers, but they do spend a lot of time talking to people on the ground here, and they tend to recommend what we think generally look like pretty reasonable economic and social reforms. And certainly on that metric, the pace of reform has slowed. I think it's partly to do with what Nick said. There was a real need for change in the 80s and early 90s. There was some low-hanging fruit, at least in hindsight, looks like low-hanging fruit that was pushed through. When we look at the sort of reforms that we're talking about now, in a lot of ways they are more complex. When you start to talk to things like changes to human services, how do you ensure that you have better teacher quality, for example? Those sort of things there is implementation challenges, which I think are more tricky than doing something like privatising an electricity network. It's just harder to land. The other point I would say is when we went back through that exercise and looked at reforms, the other thing that changed really post the mid-2000s was we started to see reforms were introduced and then wound back. So things like carbon price, things like demand-driven higher ed, people expended a lot of political capital on those reforms, only to see them wound back by the next government. And I think that I feel like the way in which the political game has played, it feels to me to be more combative and more willing to sort of wind things back. Means people are less likely to spend that political capital in the first place. So I think there's a lot of different things that are feeding into why it is that it's so hard to get change now.
Emma, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting comparison to make. And of course, I agree with Danielle that the political environment is terribly combative. And of course, we've seen a lot of reforms introduced in the Rudd and Gillard years wound back. I don't know, though, that things were any less combative in the 80s. I think the difference was that actually we had a government that was in power for 13 years, and then we had a government that was in power for 11 years. And it takes 3 terms of government to embed significant reform to the point where it has accepted and become part of Australian society, and Medicare is a great example of that. It was very contested early on, introduced by Whitlam, removed by Fraser, reintroduced early on by Hawke. And by the time Howard came to power, it was politically impossible really to wind Medicare back. So I think the volatility of the political system has as much to do with the difficulty of reform as does the combative nature of it. I guess I also am a political pragmatist, and I know from experience of working in government as an advisor that most change is achieved incrementally, and most change is actually achieved through consensus building. Even in the minority parliament under Gillard, the most legislation was passed, but most of it was done through negotiation rather than through conflict. However, I don't agree with Nick that there's no need for significant reform. And one thing he said in his presentation that really struck me was the unwillingness of people under 35 to take risks. And I think that's probably true. But I think there's a good reason for that. And that is because the insecurity being experienced by Australians under 35 now is very, very sharp compared to previous generations. So some research we did recently found that 40% of Australians under 35 are in some form of insecure employment. They're either part-time or casual on a fixed-term contract. And a third of them have never had a job with sick pay. And so it becomes much more difficult to take risks in your life if you don't have the security that allows you to do so. We know that it's harder for them to get onto the housing market, that younger people are putting off having children because of uncertainty around their economic future and also the environmental future. So I do think there is a need for reform if we're going to see Australians of future generations, particularly after this massive economic downturn that has the potential to scar a generation of Australians economically for decades. If we don't see some reforms to our employment system, to the provision of secure, well-paid jobs, a rebalancing of that flexibility in the workplace back towards a little bit more towards workers and away from employers. And that's not to say that flexible work isn't great. It's come to the fore during this crisis, but it's often code for insecure and underpaid jobs. So I think if we want to see a generation that is able to take risks and build businesses and build good lives in the way that previous generations of Australians have done, we need to recognise that the foundations of our economy for those people are a lot shakier than they were even during the last recession when I finished school. And so I think there is a need for significant reform and for us to invest in our young people so that the promise of Australia, as the Prime Minister likes to put it, isn't lost for a generation.
One type of reform that did not make it onto any of your top three is tax reform. And that's interesting to me. Being an organization focused in New South Wales, we are hearing a lot about tax reform. We're talking about a lot about tax reform. The Treasurer, Perrottet, is promoting a pretty ambitious tax reform agenda, trying to get other states to be interested, trying to get Commonwealth government to be interested. I don't really know what the prospects for that are, but certainly we are making the argument that without changing some of the underlying tax settings, it's going to be difficult to get back to full employment and have the level of job creation, starting new firms and starting new industries that is going to be necessary to recover from the job destruction of this recession. Are we overstating that? Is it okay to, are the current tax settings good enough, even if they're not optimum? Emma, let's start with you on that. Maybe go in reverse order.
Sure, thanks, Gabrielle. Yeah, tax, so I think I think we do need tax reform, but probably in the opposite direction to which it's being talked about at the moment. So to start with business tax reform, actually our business tax reform doesn't favour startups, it doesn't favour small businesses, and it doesn't favour risk-taking. It favours big multinational corporations. And a headline cut in the company tax rate is not going to do anything to change that. I think incentives, we need to look at much more microeconomic reforms to the tax system, so research and development incentives. Perhaps one of the really interesting ideas, and I'm not fully sold on it yet, but it's certainly interesting, is a cash flow tax rather than a company profits tax, which Ross Garnaut and Craig Emerson have talked about. So I do think there are some settings that could, as I said earlier, encourage business to invest and to innovate more. They're currently not encouraged to do that by our taxation system. And just cutting the headline tax rate doesn't do anything to fix that. So I would like to see that addressed. I think that the stage 3 tax cuts that the government's now talking about bringing forward in terms of personal income taxes are wrong-headed and regressive, and we can't afford them at this point in time. I do agree with some of the cuts in stage 2. I think addressing bracket creep is essential, because it does mean that people are incentivised to move up a bracket and to work harder and to be promoted. But we're already providing huge amounts of tax concessions to the top 20% of income earners in this country. And it has done very little, if anything, to spur wage growth and job growth over the last 10 years. And the other measure that I think really desperately needs to be addressed is that we don't tax wealth. And I'm not, suggesting that we implement a death tax or any of those scary things, but actually wealth is the real builder of inequality. And the fact that we have seen low inflation around the world, stagnant wages, and that Australia's employment rate and underemployment rate has really been struggling now for a decade or more, is partly to do with the fact that there's too much capital wealth being hoarded in the economy globally. And it's not moving. We don't have that, the velocity of money through the economy that we need in order to spur innovation and spur new businesses and new growth and invest in ideas, like Nick said, of new manufacturing back into the country. So I think we do need quite complex tax reform. I'm not in favour of the kind of blunt instrument of dropping the company tax rate, increasing the GST. Those are regressive moves that do nothing to target investment and innovation in the economy. And I think it's a much more complex argument than we usually get through the public discourse and the media.
Danielle, what are your views on this?
Look, I normally would have tax reform in my top 3 probably in any other time, and it's certainly something that I spend a lot of time thinking about and writing about, and I do think it is important that we improve the efficiency of the way we collect taxes. There is a lot of scope for improvement in the tax base. You know, Emma's touched on corporate taxes, and I also think the proposal for the cash flow tax is a really interesting one, and one that deserves further consideration. Some of the state tax reforms that you were referring to there, Gabrielle, in particularly the land tax stamp duty swap is really the kind of the low-hanging fruit of tax reform, if I could put it that way. You know, that is one that economists have been banging on about for longer than I can remember.
Hundreds of years, in fact.
Yeah, indeed, that's right. All the way back. It's been politically hard. I would say, you know, I think it is the right time to prosecute that reform. I think the New South Wales government had done the work pre-COVID, but I think COVID does open up an interesting opportunity there. I mean, the real barrier to that reform has always been the fact that, you know, people that have recently paid stamp duty are suddenly going to get a bill in the mail for land tax, and that feels really unfair. So the only way to kind of smooth that transition is either to bring it in slowly over time, as they're doing in the ACT, or to do something around exempting people that have recently moved house and paid stamp duty. That's not attractive to governments because clearly it means a hole in the budget for a period. That is more feasible in the current environment. So the upfront sticker shock of that reform is just less daunting right now. So, you know, in my view, doing something like that now, when you actually want governments pumping a bit more money into the economy, so in this case by losing tax revenue that they would have otherwise collected, but coming out the other end with a better tax base, a much more efficient tax base, and quite frankly, from a state government perspective, a much more stable tax base. The other reason stamp duties are just so dreadful is they are incredibly volatile, which just makes budgeting really, really hard for state treasurers. So that is one that I would certainly, I think, put on the agenda for the near term.
Nick, any thoughts on the tax structure for you?
Plenty. Where do I start? Look, Emma may have misunderstood what I said, but I'm certainly not saying, as she was trying to allege, that I'm not saying there's no need for reform. There is vital need for reform, but we want reform that is implementable, and also, I think you also made the point, Emma, that reform needs to stick. I mean, it's no good. You can't, and that's what happened in the 80s and 90s. I mean, I was there, maybe you're too young, but there was a huge amount of bipartisanship in that reform. Not only that, but you had the whole press gallery actively edging them on, you know, serious people at the Fin Review and Australian and the Sydney Morning Herald just saying, you've got to do more reform. Now that's gone, right? So you're not going to do it. There is a lot we need a reform in the tax system, but I think the way to go about it is to look at you know, the smaller tax changes, and then explain to people why it's going to make a difference to their lives. So in this environment, you know, we've got to do something about the taxes that are a disincentive to jobs and investment. And you know, obviously payroll tax is an obvious thing we should be looking at. I agree with the stamp duty question too, that has, as we know, unintended consequences down the road. I'm rather puzzled that Emma should say that we can't afford to give the promised tax cuts, given that it's not government's money, it's people's money, and surely we all agree that we want families are going to need some form of relief right now, and are going to need, you know, money to go out and spend in the economy to get the thing going again. So that would seem to be an obvious one. Likewise for me, a corporate tax. I mean, again, we want investment. I think we're all agreed we need new investment in this country. And if you think that our high rate of corporate tax is not a disincentive to investment by foreign companies, then, you know, you've got rocks in your head, in my view. Obviously, you can see the benefits that have came to Ireland, for instance, by lowering its company tax rate and getting big multinationals to invest there and bring jobs there. You can see what's happening in the States right now. So these things all have to be done. And nuisance taxes right across the board need to be addressed. The things that were supposed to be done with the GST, but the states didn't seem to keep their end of the bargain. But fundamentally, we do need to look at the big picture in terms of our tax base, because, as we know, there's this aging demographic. It's a wonderful thing, we're living longer, but it does mean that the dependency ratio, you know, the number of people actually employed and paying tax compared to those not doing so, is going to become a big problem in the next 30, 40 years. So to rely so heavily on income tax as we do is clearly going to present us with troubles. And I think, Emma, you put your finger on I think where the real tension in this tax debate is, and that's whether you tax income or wealth. And that's a hugely politically charged question, as we saw at the last election, with, you know, where the Shorten opposition went with its proposals for you know, to look at negative gearing and those sort of things. You know, it's any attack on people's earned wealth that they thought was their own money, I think is going to be very hard to implement, particularly as that over 55 demographic is the one that's going to grow very, very fast, really to the end of the century. So, and just to round that off, at the other end, I agree with you wholeheartedly that the under 35s, let's call them that for the sake of argument, the millennials, if you like, whatever you define them, we really need to look at what's happening there. We need to look at why they're not buying houses, because we want them to. We need to look at whether it's anything, could it remotely be to do with your arguments about higher education on demand, you know, that people spend longer out of the productive workforce at that early stage of their career, and they're not earning wealth, so they're leaving university after doing their third degree at 29 and they haven't got a cent to their name. So I don't know, these are you know, it's no simple answer to this, but one thing we'll be looking at very closely in the next year is how we can improve the chances and the confidence of the under 35s.
I know I've learned in my time here that an inheritance tax is considered impossible in Australia. I'm old enough to remember when people who believed in capitalism thought that you should earn your own money and there should be 100% inheritance tax. But that may be more of a certain libertarian American strand that thinks that. Let me turn to another area of reform. And Emma, I want to pick up again on, it was a small comment you made about climate transition. And I know even the words just transition are now controversial within Australian labor circles, but it's a little bit the elephant in the room if we're having a conversation about economic reform, which this largely is. Sooner or later, the coal exports are going to stop. And you could really say that people are being lied to when they're being told that they don't have to transition. I saw a study that the CFMEU did comparing the Ruhr Valley and Appalachia as two different approaches to winding down a coal economy, and obviously Appalachia hasn't gone the right way. No. But I understand since then that that even that kind of debate about which way are we going to go is no longer even happening, and there's sort of a let's just avoid this as long as possible. But Emma, you raised the need to have some reforms that are specifically targeted toward the communities that are going to be most impacted by the decline of carbon intensive industries. What do we know about what would be effective to do that?
It's a great question, and thank you for raising it. So we did some research. My colleague Shelley Jackson did a short study last year of the economic impact on 3 regions of Australia that are heavily reliant on coal industries, and what the impact would be of just shutting down coal quickly, practically overnight. It would be devastating economically for those regions and socially. And we know actually when you go out and talk to people in those regions, it's not that they love working as miners, it's that they love having a job, and they love having a job that pays well and in which they can build a life. Now, when Australia, I love to use the example of Sir John Monash, who of course was the architect of the State Electricity Commission here in Victoria. And when brown coal in the 1930s was the fuel of the modern world, you know, and it led to prosperity throughout the 20th century. But he created the Yallourn power plant and its economic settings and its social settings in a way that put the needs of the working people at the forefront. So they actually built like an ideal village in a way, the kind of Cadbury idea of everyone having a house and a piece of land and all the workers having a very good standard of living. It requires government to actively take those decisions to do that. The term just transition is not favoured by people that work in existing fossil fuel industries, because it's HR speak for we're going to transition you out of a job, right? And the argument really needs to be, and we're doing this work with the Labour Environment Action Network at the moment, that, as you say, it's no good pretending that coal isn't going to end, because it is. The market is already making that decision. Nothing government can do will stop that from happening. However quickly or slowly it happens, it will happen within at least my children's lifetime. I was an old mother, so I can say that. My child's very young, as you saw. And so the responsible thing for government to do is to say what's next for these regions. And Ross Garnaut's book again on superpower, on Australia's ability to really be at the forefront of an energy revolution. And that doesn't just mean, it means obviously solar power, wind power, but hydrogen, that power that can drive industry and that can build new primary industries, new advanced manufacturing, new forms of agriculture, and really just to work with the private sector and to say, okay, in this particular region, we have a highly skilled workforce that have XYZ skills. What's the next step for them? And using the kind of modelling that's been done by Harvard University and the MIT on economic complexity, which is often just cited as a way of demonstrating the lack of complexity in Australia's economy. But it can also be applied in a way that looks at the natural resources of a region, the human resources and skills resources of a region, and then identifies the next industry that can drive that economy. Because regional economies across Australia sprung up around primary industry, and all the other jobs flow from that. So it doesn't matter how many promises we make about services jobs, tourism jobs, you know, hospital and other jobs, they're all very important. But without a primary industry, those regions feel, I think quite rightly, that their economies are built on foundations of sand. So it's absolutely critical that we start to think, and we should have started to think 20 years ago, but as they often say, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. We must get into those debates and have a government's industry policy and working with the private sector to say, what is the next job? What is the next industry for this region, for regions across Australia? And how then do we ensure that investment flows into those opportunities and that you're not transitioning out of a $200,000 a year job in the mining sector to going to work as a barista, but into an equally skilled and well-paid job in a new industry. Not that there's anything wrong with being a barista, but it's a kind of shorthand for not recognising people's skills and abilities. And it shouldn't be beyond our ken. It's the role, I often like to say, the opposite of small government isn't big government, it's smart government. It's government that identifies where it should and can intervene to enable the market to work better in the interests of people.
That's a good line. Nick, any thoughts on reforms for the climate exposed parts of the economy?
Well, I mean, I think we have to start by realising that energy transition, as we call it, has been going on really since, our ancestors started to build campfires, right? So they moved from, and always the move was from a more energy dense fuel. So they went from wood to charcoal to coal, each one being more energy dense. And so I think there's an inevitability about the transition, even if you take out the anxieties about climate change. There's an inevitability about this, and the amount of research and development that's being done means there is an inevitability about us moving to a more energy dense fuel, and thank goodness for that, because coal's a messy thing and it's dangerous and all sorts of problems with it. And you'd think that the natural transition therefore would be to you know, the next more energy dense available technology, which might be nuclear, it might be hydrogen, you know, maybe something else, or it may indeed be gas, which is more energy dense than coal. So, you know, that process has to occur in line with the technology. And the problem with trying to mandate that we get out of coal by X date and we move to zero emissions by 2050 is you're announcing a policy to which you don't know how it's going to occur, because we don't yet have a technology suitable of getting us to zero emissions. We're a long way from it. And if we think that the energy dilute sources of wind and solar alone are going to do it, then I don't think that that's feasible. But there is a big role to play for wind and solar. We have abundant resources of almost every energy source in this country. We've invested twice as much per capita in wind and solar than the next highest, which is Germany. So we have a lot of this stuff there, and it can be a very useful asset to us in lowering our carbon emissions once we can find the backup for it. And gas is the most suitable there at the moment, best suitable technology. So you just have to, I think, allow this to go at the pace of the technology and not be hung up on the fact we've got to go to zero tomorrow because we can't do it, right? We can just need to have a path.
If I may, I was more asking not about Australia's own energy generation mix, but about the the export sector.
Well, I don't think we need to worry too much about that yet, because the markets in Asia are huge and aren't going to diminish anytime soon. When you look at this round of investment in coal generation in Japan, for instance, but certainly in India and other countries, they're not going to write off those power stations tomorrow. They're going to need coal. So over time, that you'd expect that there would be a diminution of coal exports, but I don't think it's going to be as dramatic and rapid as some people are predicting.
All right, Danielle, any thoughts on this? I was really asking about, I mean, I think Nick is arguing that it's not really a problem, but I was asking about a problem. What is the future for the coal-dependent communities as coal exports ramp down?
Yeah, and look, I think it's a really important question, and I think it's one that really came to the fore at the last election around the debates on climate change. You could see quite different attitudes around other parts of the nation compared to those communities, and for the reasons Emma said, they're justifiably worried about their future. The market is moving, the pace is in question, as Nick says, but I think it is important to be forward-looking on these things. So, I'm not normally as enthusiastic probably around industry policy as maybe Emma and Nick have been, but, I think where there is a major transition in the economy and where there is a clear and concentrated group of losers, we do have an obligation to try and look after those people. Often that's sort of saying we should try and help them reskill and retrain, but if that's where they live and there's no jobs there, that's only got limited benefit. So I do think it is important to look at what might be the industries that help replace this. Grattan did a project essentially asking that very question. What could be the next thing that would stack up economically, which actually can stand on its own 2 feet, yet would be jobs intensive and be able to be located in those types of areas where they're currently digging coal out of the ground. And certainly the top of the list that we identified was green steel. So steel produced via hydrogen. We think that there will be a growing market for a greener product as more countries move to stronger action on climate change. It's jobs intensive. It makes sense to put it in those sorts of regions. So I think that's one where there is really a role for government, not necessarily to be there putting huge amounts of money in it, but be working out the foundations so that industry can actually start to spring up and replace those jobs.
All right, let me close with a question about what it means to be running a think tank. All 3 of you are doing work to try to influence the direction of Australia. So as you boil it down to the essence, what is it that, what's your theory of change? What is your idea on how the work you do will translate into change in the real world if you succeed as you hope to? And maybe Emma, I'll start with you.
It's a very important question, and one that we grapple with every day. And I think, you know, we have here today 3 quite different think tanks. Nick's outfit is officially aligned with the Liberal Party. Danielle's is a very much a research institute that's focused on policies that could be applied by either side of politics, and fiercely non-partisan. Per Capita is independent, but certainly seen as, and I think rightly so, aligned to the Labor Party more than any other political movement, in particular because we are about addressing inequality. Our theory of change really comes down to, yes, we want to have influence with politicians and policymakers, and yes, we often propose policy ideas and ideas for change that we hope will be adopted by ideally any side of politics that saw the merit in it. But we are also really focused on the public conversation, because I think one of the failures of social democratic parties and social democratic thinkers around the world over the last 30 years has not been to cohesively and eloquently argue for a vision of the world that can compete with what has become a very embedded supply side, if neoliberal, if you like, although I don't really like the term, view of the world. And that there seems now to be a polarisation in society that you are either entirely pro-free market, rampant capitalism, or you are completely socialist, green left, and actually a centre-left pathway that recognises the benefits of the market, recognises the benefits of trade and of globalisation, but wants to see a sufficient role of government and of communities and of people in regulating those in the national interest and focusing on increased living standards rather than just headline growth, is a narrative and is a voice that has become somewhat crowded out by the more extreme positions in society. So our theory of change is to try to re-articulate that in a way that connects with people and their lived experience and brings ordinary people into the conversation as well, and demystifies some of the jargon and the you know, highfalutin technical terms that often dominate policy debate, and put them in a way that people can relate to and understand.
Wow, okay. Nick, how do you think about your role?
Well, I mean, I think the only thing that matters is that you win arguments. The art of politics is the art of persuasion. So I suppose that we are the persuaders, if you like. We're not, you know, our view is not, you know, in a democratic society, in a very healthy democratic society like ours, you need to have strong arguments being put out there in the public arena. Not just in the public arena, incidentally. We do a fair bit of work, you know, on the media and putting out reports and presenting those reports. But we also do a lot of work, I think, which isn't seen so much, which is behind the scenes, which is about corralling people behind, you know, a sensible position. I mean, within the Liberal Party, for instance, you know, it's a party of individuals, lots of different positions, but if we can see a good way through a policy argument that can unite the party, we'll prosecute that within the party. So it's all about doing, and I'm sure both Danielle and Emma would agree, there's no textbook, there's no instruction manual for running a think tank, but if you keep your eye on the prize, which is to you know, to determine what you think is good for the nation and go out and prosecute that, then you find, you know, many ways to get that, make that happen.
If someone can write that textbook, I'd like to read it. The textbook on how to run a think tank. Okay, Danielle, let's close with you.
All right. Well, I think when I took this job, it was a former Liberal minister said to me that there's something slightly weird about people that run think tanks. So I don't know what everyone else in this room thinks, but you know, a slightly strange group, I think, is the way he described us, all of us. But look, so absolutely the hearts and minds point that Emma and Nick have both made is incredibly important part of what we do. You know, we do what I think is very high quality policy research, but you know, there's no point saying what you think the right answer is if you haven't brought people along with you. We also obviously spend a lot of time talking to decision makers, pushing that art of persuasion that Nick's pointed to. We focus very much on the practical. So, you know, not always pushing first best policy if we don't think that can get up, but looking at realistic second and third best at times. And I think probably more so than other think tanks, Grattan spends a lot of time talking to the public service as well, which I think is really important for longer term policy change, getting your work and your agenda in the bureaucrat's top drawer, so that it's there in periods when governments are looking for advice. And I suspect the type of empirical based policy work that we do sort of is, you know, appealing to the public service, and we have a very good and constructive relationship with them.
Wow, well, I really loved that last round of answers. That's very inspiring for our own little think tank. I want to thank all three of you for taking time with us today to talk about this, talk about the ideas that would make a difference for the future of Australia. Everybody, thank you for joining. And we'll see you at the next edition of Committee for Sydney Live.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gabrielle.